The night she got fired, Serena counted exactly $14.62 in her coat pocket and decided that was enough to get her through until Friday. It wasn't. She'd been letting herself into the Volkov building through the service entrance for 3 years. Every morning at 6:48, before the cleaning crew finished their last sweep of the lobby, before the security rotation changed over at 7. She knew the blind spot in camera 4 on the east corridor. She knew the elevator to the 32nd floor would stick between 2 and 3. If you didn't hold the door button for a full 2 seconds after pressing close. She knew that Konstantin Volkov took his coffee black with half a spoon of sugar, and that he would look at the mug before he looked at you, and that if the coffee was right, the morning had a chance of being bearable. She knew all of this, and none of it mattered anymore. The termination letter had been waiting on her desk Thursday at 5 p.m., slipped under her keyboard like a parking ticket. No conversation, no warning. Serena had read it twice, folded it in thirds, and put it in her bag. She'd finished entering the Q3 variance reports before she left, because someone had to. 2 weeks later, she was 3 days behind on rent, and the agency hadn't called back. It was the kind of cold that came off Lake Ontario in November like a personal insult, the kind that got into the gaps between your collar and your scarf and stayed there. Serena walked the long way home from the transit stop because the shorter route went past the building, and she wasn't ready to look at it yet. She'd been taking the long way for 11 days. On the 12th day, she slipped on ice outside the Spadina entrance of a convenience store that hadn't salted its walk properly, caught herself on the brick, and stood there for a moment with her palm bleeding and her pride gone and the wind coming straight off the water. She wrapped her hand in the takeout napkins she found in her coat pocket, left over from the last lunch she'd bought herself before the termination, and kept walking. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building on Palmerston that had been promising new windows for 2 years. The radiator in the main room worked. The one in the bedroom made noise but generated almost no heat. Serena had learned to sleep in her socks with an extra blanket pulled from the closet shelf and had stopped thinking of it as a problem. Problems required solutions. This was just the situation. She was at her kitchen table trying to cut the edges of the napkin away from where it had dried to her palm when someone knocked on her door. She wasn't expecting anyone. The knock came again. Not urgent, not polite either. The kind of knock that was used to doors opening. Serena put down the scissors, looked at her wrapped hand, and went to the door. She looked through the peephole first. Old habit from a neighborhood she'd lived in 5 years ago, kept because caution was free. Volkov was standing in her hallway, not a man who looked like him, not a car outside on the street, not a message from someone on his behalf. Konstantin Volkov himself, in a charcoal overcoat that had probably cost more than her last 4 months of rent, standing in the corridor of her 3rd floor walk-up under a light fixture missing one of its 2 bulbs. Serena stood with her hand on the door and didn't move for 4 full seconds. Then she opened it. He didn't look surprised to see her. He looked the way he always looked, like he was arriving at a meeting he'd already decided the outcome of. His eyes went to her hand first, then to her face. "You're bleeding," he said. "I slipped." She didn't step back from the doorframe. "Mr. Volkov, you don't have my address. Those are confidential." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "Are you going to let me in?" Every reasonable part of her said no. He had fired her. Not personally, which was somehow worse, because it meant she hadn't warranted the conversation. She had worked for the Volkov group for 3 years, had covered for absences and late filings, and one very significant discrepancy in a contract payment schedule that she had caught and quietly corrected before it became a regulatory problem, and she had gotten a letter under a keyboard. "No," she said. Something moved in his expression, not surprise. Something more like recalibration. "There's a situation," he said. "There are always situations. You have a director of operations and a head of finance. You have 17 people whose literal job is handling situations. The situation involves you." She looked at him. The corridor was cold. The building's heating was inconsistent above the 2nd floor. She was standing in socked feet and he was in a coat that probably had cashmere lining, and she was very aware of both of these facts. "Come in," she said, and stepped back. He came in without looking at the apartment the way most people did when they saw it for the first time. The careful arrangement of second-hand furniture, the curtains that were just slightly too short, the shelves she'd built herself from boards and brackets, because a bookcase would have cost $200 she didn't have. He looked at the kitchen table, at the scissors, at the first aid kit she'd pulled out that was mostly depleted because she'd been getting through it in pieces for months. He went to the table, picked up the kit, looked inside it. "Sit down," he said. "Mr. Volkov, sit down, Serena." She sat down, because her hand hurt, and because she was tired, and because there was something in his voice that had nothing to do with authority, or rather it had exactly that, but it also had something underneath it that she couldn't quite name. She'd worked for him for 3 years, and she'd learned to read the layers of him. There was always a layer underneath. He pulled out the gauze and the antiseptic with the quiet efficiency of someone who dealt with worse than this, which she suspected was true. "You should have cleaned it immediately," he said. "I was going to. The napkin was still stuck to it. I noticed." He looked up at her briefly. She held still. His hands were careful. That was the thing that surprised her, or maybe it didn't. She'd watched him handle crisis paperwork with the same focused precision, the same economy of movement. He cleaned the cut without making a performance of it, dressed it without pulling the tape tighter than necessary. "It's not deep," he said. "I know. I've had worse." He didn't respond to that. He sat back in the chair across from her and looked at her, and she had the sensation she often had in his office, that he was reading something in her that she hadn't intended to show. "You didn't ask me why I'm here," he said. "You said there was a situation. You didn't ask what kind. You'll tell me when you want to." She looked at her hand. The dressing was neat, neater than she would have managed on her own. "I've learned your pacing, Mr. Volkov. You tell people things when you've decided to tell them, not before." He was quiet for a moment. "The variance reports you filed in October," he said, "the ones from the Lafleur account." She looked up. "They've been flagged by the external auditors, specifically the reconciliation figures on the third quarter closing statement." "They were correct," she said immediately. "I know." She waited. "The figures were altered after you submitted them," he said, "before the external copy was transmitted." The room went very quiet. The radiator in the main room knocked once, twice, then settled. "Who?" she said. "Bertrand Morel. He was terminated this week." She thought about Morel. Mid-level analyst, been with the company 4 years, always slightly too interested in what other people were working on. She'd noticed it and filed it as a personality trait and moved on. "He altered them to show a discrepancy that looked like mine," she said. "Yes, and then I was terminated." "Yes." She looked at the table, at the scissors she'd been using on the napkin, at the kit with its half-empty bottles and its last strip of gauze. "I see," she said. That was all she said. Because what else was there? She could be angry, she was angry, but the arithmetic of the situation was already running in her head, and anger didn't change the figures. She had been a convenient explanation for something someone else had done. She had been removed efficiently. Now that explanation didn't hold, and Volkov was in her kitchen at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday in November, which meant the situation had implications beyond her termination. "What does the auditor know?" she said. "Enough to flag the account, not enough to trace the alteration back to its source. The metadata on the original submission was overwritten. But you know it was Morel. We have other evidence. It's enough for the internal case. It is not enough for what the auditors will want to see." She understood then, or she understood the shape of it. "You need the original figures," she said, "the ones I actually submitted. We need someone who can reconstruct the reconciliation trail in a way that will satisfy a forensic audit." "I have the working documents," she said. "I keep copies." He looked at her. Something in his face shifted, not surprise exactly, but the particular expression of a man who has made a calculation and found the answer was better than he'd allowed for. "Where?" he said. "On my personal drive. I always kept backups of anything I thought might come back. Not company files, working notes, process documentation. The kind of thing that wouldn't be in the system. She'd started doing it after year 1, when she'd caught an error in a payments ledger that no one could reconstruct how it had happened. She'd kept it quiet, she'd fixed it. And she'd decided that she would always have her own record of her own work. She pulled her laptop from the end of the table, opened it and turned it toward him. He looked at the files. He didn't touch the keyboard. He looked at her instead. "You've been protecting yourself," he said. Flat, not accusatory. Observational. "I've been protecting the work," she said. "It's the same thing." He looked at her for a long moment. "I need you to come back," he said. She laughed. It came out shorter and sharper than she intended. "I was fired, I'm aware, via a letter under my keyboard. That was Morel's work as well. He had a relationship with one of the HR coordinators. I see." She closed the laptop. Opened it again. Closed it. "And if I come back, the position would be different," he said. "Head of Internal Financial Controls. The role doesn't currently exist." She looked up. "It would," he said, "if you agreed to take it." She thought about the $14 in her pocket, about the rent 3 days overdue, about 11 days of taking the long way home. She thought about Morel and the neat, deliberate way someone had moved her out of the way, and the anger that was sitting very still in her chest, waiting for somewhere to go. "I want to see the audit file," she said. He didn't hesitate. He reached into his coat and put a folder on the table. She opened it. "Read." The radiator knocked. She turned pages. It took her 20 minutes. He didn't speak. He sat across the table in his expensive coat in her cold apartment and waited, and she gave him credit for that, because she knew he was a man who did not wait easily for anything. "The third entry on page 11, she said finally. He leaned across slightly to look. "That reconciliation reference is wrong," she said. Morel used the wrong account code when he altered it. He was matching a pattern he'd seen in the system, but he used a code that was retired in 2022. "I know because I was the one who retired it and rebuilt the structure. No one else would know to look for that." She looked up. He was watching her. "I can reconstruct the full trail," she said. "I can give you something the auditors can follow. It'll take me about 2 days. I can give you access to the systems tonight. I'm not going into that building tonight." He absorbed this. "Tomorrow," she said. 8 a.m. and I want the position in writing before I start." She said it the way she'd watched him speak in meetings, not asking, not demanding, stating. He was quiet for a long moment. "All right," he said. She nodded. She looked at her hand with its careful dressing. She looked at the folder. She looked at the man across the table who had fired her and come to her home at 8 o'clock in November and bandaged her hand without being asked to. "There's one more thing," he said. He said it the way he said things he'd been deciding whether to say. "Go ahead," she said. "The Lafleur account is one of 6. Morel had access to all of them. We believe the alterations may go back further than Q3. She felt the shape of that land. "How much further?" she said. "Potentially 2 years. 2 years. She had been with the company for 3, which meant she had been, potentially, the only person positioned to have caught this earlier than it was caught, and she hadn't. She didn't say that, she sat with it. "I missed it," she said finally. "He was careful," Volkov said. "I should have caught it. Perhaps." He didn't argue with her, and she didn't want him to. She wanted the truth of it, and the truth was that somewhere in 2 years of careful, meticulous work, there had been something she hadn't looked at closely enough, and now it was her problem too. Not because of the termination letter or the audit or the new role he was offering, because it was her work. Because her name was attached to those figures in ways that Morel couldn't have entirely erased. "I'll need everything," she said. "All 6 accounts. Everything from the past 2.5 years. I'll have it pulled tonight, and I'll need to talk to whoever manages the system access logs. I need to see the timestamps every entry, every alteration. I'll arrange it, and Morel's access history, already secured." She nodded, looked at the table, the folder, her bandaged hand. "Why did you come yourself?" she said. Not accusatory, genuinely curious. He had 17 people, he had a head of operations. He had a dozen ways to send this message without sitting in a third-floor walk-up in the cold. He looked at her the way he sometimes had in meetings, not through her but directly at her, in the way that made other people in rooms shift in their seats. "Because it was my mistake," he said, "and I don't send other people to correct my mistakes." She thought about that, about the arithmetic of it, about the kind of man who shows up personally to a situation he has created, sits in someone else's kitchen, and bandages a hand he didn't cause to bleed. She thought about what she knew of him, which was a considerable amount after 3 years, and what she didn't know, which was the part that had always sat just at the edge of every working conversation they'd had, something kept very deliberately behind the professionalism. 8 a.m., she said. "I'll have a car here at 7:45. I don't need a car. I know the way." Something moved in his face. It might have been the closest thing to a smile she'd ever seen from him at close range. He stood, picked up his coat from where he'd laid it across the back of the chair, looked at her. "The position," he said. "It comes with a different office. On 32, not 30. 32 was his floor." She looked at him evenly. "I'll need adequate storage for documentation. You'll have it." He moved to the door, and she walked him there because it was her apartment, and it was the thing to do. He stopped in the doorway with his hand on the frame and looked back at her, at the kitchen with its careful furniture and its depleted first aid kit, and the laptop on the table with its 3 years of meticulous backup files. "For what it's worth," he said, and stopped. "Mr. Volkov," she said. He looked at her. "You can finish that sentence tomorrow, after I've seen the access logs." He looked at her for a moment. Then he went. She closed the door, stood with her back against it for a moment in the quiet of her apartment, with the radiator knocking and the wind off the lake, finding the gap in the window frame. Then she went to the table, opened her laptop, and started pulling up the files. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And this time, she was going to make sure every number was exactly where she had put it, and that no one, not Morel, not anyone, would be able to move them again without her knowing. She worked through until 2 in the morning. When she finally closed the laptop and stood and went to the window, the street below was empty, and the cold had settled into the kind of quiet that Toronto got in deep November, when even the city seemed to be holding its breath. She looked at her hand. The dressing was still neat. She went to bed with her socks on and the extra blanket pulled down from the shelf, and for the first time in 12 days, she didn't dream about the termination letter, or the keyboard, or the long way home. She dreamed about account codes and timestamps, and the particular satisfaction of a number that was exactly, precisely right.